On August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening, President Richard Nixon appeared on television screens across America and made an announcement that would fundamentally alter the global financial system. He suspended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. Most Americans watching had no idea what he was talking about. Wall Street was closed, the world's central bankers were caught off guard, and within 48 hours, the entire architecture of international finance, a system that had governed money for nearly 3 decades, was dead. But here's what almost nobody asks. Why did it happen on a Sunday? Why the secrecy? And more importantly, what does a decision made over 50 years ago have to do with the $34 trillion in U.S. debt we're carrying today, the inflation you're feeling at the grocery store, and the repeated boom and bust cycles that seem to define modern economics? The answer lies in a story about discipline and what happens when you abandon it. To understand what died in 1971, we need to go back to 1944. World War II is still raging, but Allied victory is becoming inevitable. In July, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission? Design a new global monetary system from scratch. The world they were leaving behind had been chaotic. The gold standard of the 19th and early 20th centuries had collapsed during World War I when countries needed to print money to fund massive military operations. The interwar period saw competitive devaluations, currency wars, hyperinflation in Germany, and ultimately the Great Depression. Money had become unstable. Trust had evaporated. The man who dominated the Bretton Woods Conference was John Maynard Keynes, the British economist whose ideas about government intervention had reshaped economic thinking. Facing him was Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury official who had his own vision. They disagreed on many details, but they agreed on one thing: the world needed a stable monetary anchor. What emerged was a compromise system. The US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. In effect, the dollar became as good as gold, and the United States promised to redeem dollars for gold on demand to foreign central banks. This was discipline by design. The system had a built-in constraint. If you wanted to run your country's economy recklessly, printing money without regard for consequences, you'd eventually face a run on your gold reserves. The fixed exchange rate to gold was a governor, a speed limit on monetary policy. But here's the question that should make you uncomfortable. What happens when the country at the center of this system, the one holding the reserve currency, decides the rules are too constraining? For about 15 years, the Bretton Woods system worked remarkably well. Post-war reconstruction happened at an unprecedented pace. International trade flourished under stable exchange rates. The era from 1945 to 1960 saw some of the highest growth rates in modern economic history. Germany and Japan rebuilt. Europe recovered. The dollar was king, and it was backed by gold. But there were cracks from the beginning, visible only to those paying attention. The Belgian economist Robert Triffin identified what became known as the Triffin dilemma in 1960. The problem was mathematical and inevitable. As the global economy grew, it needed more dollars for international trade and reserves. But if the U.S. supplied those dollars, it would eventually have more dollars circulating abroad than it had gold to back them. The system contained the seeds of its own destruction. And the United States was already straining against the discipline. The 1960s brought expensive commitments. The Vietnam War was escalating, costing billions. President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty. These were noble goals, but they were expensive, very expensive. Johnson faced a choice: raise taxes to pay for both guns and butter, or print money. He chose the politically easier path. The U.S. began running persistent budget deficits. The printing presses accelerated. Foreign central banks noticed. They started doing the math. They looked at their dollar reserves, looked at America's gold stockpile at Fort Knox, and realized the numbers didn't add up anymore. there wasn't enough gold to redeem all the dollars in circulation. By 1971, the situation had become critical. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, had been particularly aggressive, sending naval ships to New York Harbor to physically collect gold in exchange for dollars. Other countries followed suit. America's gold reserves were hemorrhaging, down from 20,000 metric tons after World War II to about 8,100 tons by 1971. The economic data was screaming warnings. Inflation was rising, the trade deficit was widening, productivity growth was slowing, and speculators in currency markets were circling, betting that the U.S. would be forced to devalue the dollar against gold. In early August 1971, a British request to convert $3 billion into gold triggered panic in the Nixon administration. If honored, it would devastate U.S. reserves. If refused, it would signal that the dollar was no longer as good as gold. Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David that August weekend. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and others debated options. Connally was blunt. "We're going to be in a hell of a mess anyway. Why not do it our way?" The decision was made to close the gold window temporarily, though that temporary closure became permanent. That Sunday night broadcast was carefully orchestrated. Markets were closed, so there couldn't be an immediate panic. Nixon framed it as defending America against currency speculators, appealing to nationalism rather than explaining the economic reality. The U.S. had printed more dollars than it could back with gold, and it was choosing to default on its promise rather than face discipline. Within days, the carefully constructed Bretton Woods system collapsed. Currency exchange rates began floating. The link between currency and gold was severed. For the first time in human history, the entire global economy operated on purely fiat currency, money backed by nothing except government decree and trust. What happened next should terrify anyone who understands cause and effect. Without the discipline of gold convertibility, governments could print money with far fewer immediate consequences. And print they did. The 1970s became a nightmare of stagflation, simultaneous high inflation, and economic stagnation, something Keynesian economists had claimed was impossible. Oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 made it worse, but the monetary foundation had already been undermined. By 1980, inflation hit 14%. Interest rates soared above 20%. An entire generation watched their savings evaporate. But here's what's rarely discussed: the psychological and structural changes that followed. Once the constraint was removed, the incentives shifted dramatically. Politicians could fund programs without raising taxes or cutting spending elsewhere. Central banks could respond to every crisis by expanding the money supply. The hard trade-offs that disciplined systems require, they became optional. Debt exploded. In 1971, total U.S. federal debt was about $398 billion. Today, it's over $34 trillion, an 85-fold increase, while the economy only grew about 19-fold in real terms. This isn't a coincidence. It's the predictable result of removing constraints. The establishment tried to claim they could maintain discipline through policy rather than systemic constraints. Central banks would be independent. They would target inflation at 2%. They would be responsible stewards of currency value. For a while, starting in the 1980s under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, this seemed to work. Volcker dramatically raised interest rates, crushed inflation, and restored some credibility to the dollar. The period from roughly 1985 to 2008 is sometimes called the Great Moderation, relatively stable growth with moderate inflation. But the 2008 financial crisis revealed that the discipline was illusory. When crisis hit, every central bank in the developed world resorted to the same playbook: print massive amounts of money, slash interest rates to zero or below, buy government and corporate bonds on an unprecedented scale. Quantitative easing became the euphemism for what previous generations would have simply called monetary debasement. And it worked, in the sense that it prevented immediate collapse. But what were the long-term costs? asset price inflation that has made housing unaffordable for younger generations, widening wealth inequality as those holding assets benefited while wage earners' purchasing power stagnated, zombie companies kept alive by cheap credit, and most dangerously, the normalization of perpetual money printing as the solution to every problem. Now let's connect this to what you're experiencing today. Look at the data from the past few years and tell me if you see patterns. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the US government printed roughly $6 trillion in 2 years, about 25% of 1 year's GDP. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion, and we saw the fastest inflation in 40 years, peaking above 9% in 2022. But here's what should keep you up at night. Even when inflation emerged, the system struggled to reimpose discipline. Raising interest rates to fight inflation means increasing the cost of servicing that $34 trillion in federal debt. At current rates, the U.S. government spends more on interest payments than on defense, over $1 trillion annually. This is the trap that unlimited money printing creates. You become addicted to low rates and monetary expansion, and returning to normal becomes economically and politically excruciating. Look at what happened with the Silicon Valley Bank collapse in March 2023, or the broader banking stress that followed. The immediate response wasn't to allow bad decisions to face consequences, it was to guarantee deposits beyond legal limits and provide unlimited liquidity. The moral hazard compounds with each crisis. Internationally, we're seeing the consequences too. Countries like China, Russia, and others are actively working to reduce dependence on the dollar, creating alternative payment systems, accumulating gold reserves, and discussing commodity-backed trade settlement. They watched what happened in 1971 and its aftermath. They understand that a currency unbacked by anything except government promise can be devalued at will, which means your savings can be confiscated through inflation. The cycles are getting more pronounced. Boom, bust, print. Boom, bust, print. Each cycle requires more monetary intervention than the last. Each crisis is solved by measures that would have been unthinkable a generation prior. We've normalized central banks directly buying corporate bonds, negative interest rates, unlimited government spending funded by monetary creation. So what does this mean for you? 3 critical takeaways. First, discipline doesn't disappear, it just changes form. When you remove systemic constraints like gold convertibility, you don't eliminate discipline, you just transfer it from the monetary system to the real economy. The discipline shows up as inflation, asset bubbles, financial crises, and boom-bust cycles. The pain doesn't go away, it just gets redistributed, often to those least able to protect themselves. Second, incentives matter more than intentions. No matter how smart or well-intentioned policymakers are, if the system incentivizes printing money to solve problems, they will print money. The gold standard wasn't perfect, it had its own issues and caused its own crises, but it created a cost to monetary expansion that made politicians and central bankers think twice. Without that cost, the path of least resistance is always to print. Third, currency debasement is a hidden tax, and it's regressive. When governments can't or won't raise explicit taxes, they fund spending through monetary expansion. This creates inflation, which hits hardest those who hold their wealth in currency, who live paycheck to paycheck, who can't afford assets that rise with inflation. The wealthy, who own stocks, real estate, gold, and other hard assets, are largely protected. Everyone else pays the invisible tax. August 15, 1971, wasn't just the day Nixon closed the gold window. It was the day we collectively decided that discipline was optional, that we could engineer our way around economic constraints, that this time would be different. More than 5 decades later, we're living with the consequences. The $34 trillion in debt, the serial asset bubbles, the inflation that destroyed 15–20% of your purchasing power in just the last few years, the sense that the system is rigged, that those who work and save are suckers while speculators and the well-connected prosper. These aren't accidents, they're features of a system designed without meaningful constraints. Here's the uncomfortable question we're left with. Can a system based purely on trust and policy discretion survive long term? Or does monetary history always bend toward discipline one way or another? Because if discipline can't come from systemic design, it will eventually come from crisis, collapse, or revolution. The next time you hear a politician or central banker promise that they'll be responsible, that they'll maintain the value of the currency through good policy alone, remember August 15th, 1971. Remember what happened when we decided discipline was too expensive, too constraining, too old-fashioned. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that you can postpone discipline, you can delay it, you can hide it, but you can't escape it forever. If this history made you see the current financial system differently, hit that like button and subscribe. We're breaking down the economic forces shaping your life that nobody else is explaining. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think we can have sound money without some form of constraint on money printing? Or are we destined to repeat these cycles until something breaks? And check out the next video where we'll explore exactly how inflation acts as a hidden tax and who really benefits from it. Thanks for watching.